Thank you all for being here. I'm Susan Page. I'm going to moderate this panel. I'm the Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today, and I am delighted to be here with a group of such distinguished panelists, any of whom could take this full panel time with what they know. Now, the question that was posed in this forum is Washington relevant? How relevant is Washington outside of Washington? As someone who's lived in Washington for a long time, I resent that as well as the hungry audience part of this, because how could we not be relevant? We're so incredibly important to everything. But perhaps that is our perception and not everyone's. We want to talk about whether that's true, whether that's changing, whether President Trump has had an effect on how relevant Washington is in cities and in states and in communities across the country. Has he captivated Americans? Has he exhausted Americans? Has he done both? Let me just very briefly introduce our panel. Next to me is James Fallows, national correspondent for The Atlantic. He has himself long experience in Washington, chief speechwriter for President Carter, among other things. He's just come out with a new book, his 10th, written with his wife, Deb, about civic resilience and America's future. It's titled Our Towns, a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America. Thanks for being with us. Next to him is Tim Lampkin. He's the CEO of Higher Purpose, which is a nonprofit in the Mississippi Delta that builds community wealth by helping to develop businesses, small businesses, make real estate investments, support social enterprise initiative. He is a candidate for a doctorate in education at the University of Arkansas, but more impressive is this: he was named to Magic Johnson's 32 under 32 list. Congratulations for that. Reihan Salam is next to him. He's the executive editor of the National Review, a contributing editor to The Atlantic, a columnist for Slate, a board member of New America, and more. He has interesting journalistic lineage. He was once an editorial researcher for David Brooks, and he was once a producer for Chris Matthews. You'll have to compare and contrast those two for us later. He has a new book coming out too. It's titled Melting Pot or Civil War. And next to him, last but not least, Charlie Sykes. He's been the voice of Wisconsin for 23 years, hosting a conservative talk show there. He is an NBC, MSNBC contributor, contributing editor at the Weekly Standard, host of the Daily Standard podcast. And his latest book, his 9th, is titled How the Right Has Lost Its Mind. So let's start. Tim, I'd like to start with you. You know, you've been watching this era of Trump, not from Washington, but from Mississippi. And I wonder if you think it has an effect. Is Washington relevant to what you're doing? Does it have an effect one way or the other in what you see happening there?
Yeah, thank you so much. Good morning. My name is Tim Lampkin, as she said. I live in a small town called Clarksdale, Mississippi. The population is 17,000. It's in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. And Washington is relevant to the work that I do, but also to the people that I work with. Low-income communities are living particularly in fear of what's going to happen. Thinking about the bad policies that have come out through this administration that are causing people to think about what's going to happen next. And looking at the communities that we work with in the Mississippi Delta, those communities are living pretty much paycheck to paycheck. And then you couple that with bad policies, people are really living in this fear of unknowing what's going to happen the next day. And so I think that's really, really important. But also, I am hopeful because people like me and others that are working across the country in their local communities are really pushing back and really creating local change to really show examples of what really systematic change looks like.
Jim Fellows, what did you find in researching this new book of yours?
So the backstory is over the past 5 years, Deb and I have been spending about half our time in smaller town America. So that's obviously predating the current DC mood, but then extending into it. And so on the one hand, let's stipulate that national government matters. And it would be better to have a functioning national government than not, to match the great resources the United States has to the great challenges the United States has. When you travel around, you see, for example, how much of the public architecture of 2018 was laid down by the WPA in the 1930s, and you know that on immigration standards and war and peace and civil rights and pollution, all these things where a national government really makes a difference. And so it would be better to have a functioning national government. We were really impressed by the way that if you didn't ask people about national politics, especially didn't ask them how crooked is Hillary, what do you think about Trump, what about the Russians, et cetera, but ask them what is happening in the Mississippi Delta, what's happening in South Dakota, what's happening in South Carolina. There was a sense of people just assuming they would have to take local responsibility for reinvention of the economies of their towns, for dealing with immigrants and refugees. And generally, we found most places feeling they had some agency and traction. And I'll wrap this up with a prediction, since we in political journalism like predictions. After the 2016 election, there was the out there narrative. If only you'd been out there, you would see what a hellscape it was and why people were voting this way, something I was skeptical of. But my prediction is a couple years from now, the out there narrative will be, if only you'd been out there with people like Tim and people like your counterparts who we've met through this conference, you would see how much reinvention, renewal, resistance, recovery, all these things were underway in this dispersed mode across the country.
Well, Charlie Sykes, I'm not sure we see that in Wisconsin, though. I mean, Wisconsin seems to reflect the same sort of gridlock and polarization and fierce partisanship that we see in Washington.
Yeah, no, I want to concur in part and dissent in part on all of that, because I'm a big believer in local and state governments being laboratories of democracy. And I do think that there's a moment, especially with the rancor and the dysfunction in Washington, a kind of a rebirth of federalism. Like, if we're going to solve things, if we're going to talk to one another, we have to do it at the local level. On the other hand, you do get the sense that what's happening in Washington has sucked so much of the oxygen, out of our, state and local debates. For example, in Wisconsin, where the voters are intensely engaged in the political process. We have a primary coming up in 6 weeks. The candidate who was running for governor of the state of Wisconsin against Scott Walker, who was endorsed by the Democratic Convention, in the latest poll, 88% of voters said they didn't know enough about her to have an opinion. The leading candidate in the poll, 61%. The rest were 80%, we don't know, we don't know, we don't know. This tells me that in fact, so much of the attention has been sucked up into national politics that it is hard to debate some of these local issues. And then, of course, you have these larger systemic issues, which is the decimation of local journalism. Even though we have very, very robust journalism in Washington and New York, you have news deserts throughout much of the country. You have the decline of local journalism, plus the siloing of our media. So you do have this disconnect, I think, from a lot of the political issues. Now, going back to your issue, Wisconsin, I think the politics of the year will be that, we will do things that the federal government won't do. But I'm just not sure what the effect, again, on the democratic dialogue is, with so much of the bandwidth taken up by what's happening in Washington, D.C.
Reihan, what do you think?
Well, first, to build on Charlie's remarks, I think it really is true that our constitutional order is premised on the idea that you have deep and durable local allegiances. In fact, the fear was that we would not have any allegiance to a national government, and yet our politics have indeed been thoroughly nationalized to the point where actually you don't really have people focusing on issues that are distinctively state and local as often as perhaps we'd like. A larger issue, though, for me is that I think our federalism is really dysfunctional. Right now, you have people on the left and the right who embrace federalism. They are subtly different sorts of federalism, however. So on the right, you have the federalism of states' rights, the idea that we must protect the sovereignty of the states. But again, these states where you don't really have a public that is oriented towards state issues. So people vote along the lines of their national partisan allegiances on state issues in ways that oftentimes turn out pretty badly. Then on the left, you have this idea of dissenting by governing. The idea that when you have, let's say, a right-of-center government in power at the federal level, you want to pursue progressive policies at the local level and do it even when, especially when, it creates conflicts. Now, that's a very interesting idea, but to my mind, a healthier federalism is what used to be called a layer cake federalism rather than a marble cake federalism, in which there are very clear areas in which the federal government takes the lead, and there are other areas where the state governments take the lead, as opposed to what we have now, which is a bit of a mishmash, in which the federal government controls the purse strings, and then state governments have to conform to what they see as federal mandates and what have you. So, for example, you could imagine during the Reagan era, there was talk of a Medicaid swap, the idea that the federal government will take over the health safety net and state governments will take over education and certain aspects of infrastructure, et cetera. The idea that you would have more clear lines of authority and that would redound to the benefit of different jurisdictions. But then there's another problem, which we saw recently in teacher strikes across the country, particularly in poorer states. So in a place like the Mississippi Delta, you have a serious problem, which is that for literally centuries, these are areas that have had limited fiscal capacity. Now, you could say, well, you should have better policies, and then you could have more fiscal capacity. You could have more taxable resources. That's really, really hard to do when you're inheriting a legacy that is a very, very old legacy. Now, other federations around the world, what they do is they engage in revenue sharing. They say to these poorer regions, we're going to see to it that you have enough revenue to finance basic services. As an example, West Virginia and New Jersey both spend the exact same amount of money on wages for public school teachers. They both spend 1.3% of their state GDPs. But in West Virginia, that amounts to very, very low salaries, lower even than if you accounted for the cost of living there. And in New Jersey, it means not teacher salaries that every teacher is thrilled with, but teacher salaries that are a heck of a lot better than what you see in West Virginia. The problem is that whether you're in West Virginia or in New Jersey, you are an American. You are part of this larger national labor market. And if you can't actually finance those basic services, then you can have all the innovation in the world, but it's not necessarily going to get you where you want to go. So I think that that's a big picture structural problem that I think we need to do something about. And I think people on the right and the left ought to care about it.
Jim, you were taking notes.
I was taking notes, and I think there's much. We have a range of political perspectives here. I think we agree on more than we disagree with. There's one area where, as an admirer of Charlie's broadcasting and writing, where I see things differently from you, which is this sucking up the oxygen. Because something that Deb and I resolutely did when traveling around is never asking people about national politics. And if we didn't ask them about it, it didn't come up. And I'll give you just one or two illustrations. I spent last week a couple days at a mayor's college that was Yale was running, and there were about 30 mayors there, 2/3 Republicans, 1/3 Democrats, talking about various problems they shared. National politics in a day and a half of discussion didn't come up. It was all about what they were doing to schools to train people for sort of a career technical education and ways they could retire bond issues. And I think it is so natural in our business to ask people, what do you think about Trump? That it is drawn out. Just one other illustration, we spent a lot of time in South Carolina, obviously a very conservative state. There are a couple Democratic mayors there, including the mayor of Columbia, many Republican mayors, including Greenville. They're all doing essentially the same policies of having Columbia is going to a completely sustainable energy policy, and in the capital of South Carolina. And Greenville, they're having all these sort of interactive public school experiments to train poor kids in engineering. So I think it can suck up the oxygen if you ask them. And if you don't ask them, it's not most of life, in my experience.
But even if you don't ask them, is it possible to build a wall there?
Well, I'm saying that's been our experience.
Yeah.
I'd like to respond to some of the comments earlier. So you mentioned legacy and structures. And so thinking about Mississippi, you also have to take into context the institutionalized racism, the implicit bias that has happened, particularly in the Deep South. And so I think there is a lot of well-attended, well-mentioned policies and different aspects of procedures that are coming down from Washington, and then the state government are able to adopt some of those policies. But then you still have these layers, picking off what you said, there's layers of institutionalized racism where you have white school districts getting more funding than black school districts, and that this is merely a problem that no one is really talking about. So I understand your perspective, and then to really kind of talk about what you mentioned, I believe also there is another conversation around not left, not right, particularly young people that I engage with. We're talking about leaning forward into making a difference. And I understand there's political parties, but what about coming together and doing what's right for the community, doing what's right for our state, doing what's right for our nation? And so I understand that there's a lot of different complexities that go along with that, but how do we put aside those differences and talk about what we do what's right?
And of course, that should always be our goal, right?
It should be.
It ought to be our goal. Does what happened in Washington make it easier or harder to do that? Or is it irrelevant to an effort in a community or in the Mississippi Delta to address community problems?
It makes it difficult because there are a lot of folks that watch, major television, major news publications, and he mentioned earlier about the local publications. And I think what's interesting, young people are actually using the power of storytelling to really tell stories locally and really trying to complicate the narrative in these places that good work is happening. And I think oftentimes we only see kind of the negative, like this is what's bad about this place, this is what's going wrong, but what about what led to that problem? We're also countering that with what's happening and what people are doing to really create innovative solutions.
Mm-hmm. Reihan, do you want to?
Oh no, I think that your points are very well taken, Tim. I guess to the point that Jim had raised, first of all, I think that you really ought to pick up his book. It is an invaluable guide to the fact that there really is flourishing civil society across much of the country. I do think, however, that Charlie's point about the role that national partisanship plays at the state and local level is really interesting, and here's a little angle on it. So when you have partisan elections at the local level, it has pretty different implications from when you have nonpartisan elections. And I say this not as someone who is a champion of nonpartisan elections. When you have nonpartisan elections in a city where people don't necessarily have a close, immediate personal connection to their local candidates, they rely on other heuristics other than partisanship. So for example, this person has a last name that indicates this person is of my ethnicity. Or, I recognize that name, this is an incumbent, so I will vote for that person and what have you. Because, people are busy. Some of them are busy actually building these great civil society institutions that Jim talks about and that you're working on, Tim. But I think when you're talking about a lot of our politics, because national politics are so important, what you get are situations in which primary elections might matter, but general elections don't matter at all. And when primary elections matter, again, you don't have that heuristic. You don't have that shorthand to figure out, well, do I agree more with this person or more with that person? So what happens is that we wind up over-interpreting things. We say, Bill de Blasio won the mayor election in New York City. This makes let's make grand pronouncements about what that means ideologically and otherwise. Whereas actually the number of primary voters in New York City, a city with 8.5 million people, was really quite minuscule. This really exciting congressional district race where you had an incumbent tossed out by a 28-year-old organizer and activist, really extraordinary story. And she's a democratic socialist, has really strong opinions about national political issues, but she's also someone who is a third-generation Bronxite of Puerto Rican origin, and this is a district with a large Hispanic majority. So not to say that ideology didn't matter, but that's a really interesting aspect of our politics. And I often wonder, what if, and you couldn't do this because we have something called free speech in the First Amendment, but what if you had to say, you cannot run as a Republican or Democrat at the state and local level. You must create new parties that are tailored to those particular places, their circumstances, their governance challenges. As exotic as that might sound, this actually is the case in some other countries where you have totally different kind of political coalitions that reflect the median voter, the different issues that arise in those contexts. And those parties are coalitions of people who might disagree on some national questions, but who agree on these kind of more salient local and state questions.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I would like to cover that.
Well, I agree with everything he just said. But I want to go back to what Jim said, and I want to make it very clear that I am really hoping that you are right and I'm wrong. I mean, honestly. But almost any statement you make about Americans, how they engage or what they value, is true and untrue at exactly the same time, because we are not one nation. We are multiple nations. We live in two different political universes. We have separated ourselves physically. You just look at the red-blue maps. The sorting out of America is very, very real. The siloing of information is very, very real. We saw a survey yesterday that would suggest that 55% of Americans are completely disengaged from all of this news. That we're all talking about this, but 55% of Americans do not read the news even once a week. which is remarkable. That we're probably talking about a very small, slender number of people. So when I say that the national politics has sucked the oxygen out, I am probably talking about this politically engaged folks when a lot of Americans are going about their lives. The one concern that I have, and the problem with Washington is the drama is so riveting. There are not competing narratives because I think they're very difficult for state issues, with the exception of, say, Governor of Missouri tying up women and stuff like that. They
that
can
breaks
compete.
through. Yeah.
Right. But there are no competing narratives. And then there is this totalizing effect of our politics. So a guy in Wisconsin who does not care about politics, okay, what does he care about? He cares about following the Green Bay Packers and riding his Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Well, damn. Now that's been politicized as well. Now, if you're an NFL fan, you have to decide, is Trump right or is Trump wrong? Is Harley-Davidson betraying America or are they betraying Donald Trump? So there is that sifting down where it used to be that we had politics was here and then the rest of life was here. We could be nasty up here, but most of us were fundamentally decent. I think we are still fundamentally decent. But it is having an effect where, is there any element of our lives that is immune from this toxic?
And that didn't start with Donald Trump.
No.
But it's certainly been intensified
Yes.
with Donald Trump.
So to respond to this, so I entirely agree on America, land of contrast. When Deb and I were living in China, we each wrote books essentially arguing that anything you could say about China was true someplace in China. It was good, it was bad. And to a somewhat less dramatic degree, as that's the case in the United States, it's a great big country full of all kinds of contradictions. I guess the point I'm going to push on again is I agree that our national dialogue right now is both as dramatic and flamboyant and as sort of dysfunctional and bitter as it's ever been. And there is a whole lot of attention that is drawn to that. It seems to me you can still find a break point between that and most of lived life. And I'll give just one other specific example. We spent a lot of time in western Kansas before the 2016 election. Places now majority Latino, Dodge City, Garden City, Spearville, places like that. The electorate is still mainly white, and they went overwhelmingly for Trump. But these same cities that went overwhelmingly for Trump, number one, were powering their economy on a wind energy revolution. The wheat fields have all these wind turbines in it. Number two, passed a school bond issue to offset Sam Brownback's cutbacks for their school districts that were mainly Latino students. And number three, while voting for Trump, they were thinking about how they could protect their beloved city finance manager, who was there on a DACA waiver. And so I think there is some, you can say this is contradictory, but to me it's a worrisome, it's mildly reassuring, majorly worrisome breakpoint between the spectacle of our national politics and lived life.
But there's a tension there, and I wonder if the tension eventually either makes the national politics better or undermines what you're seeing.
And let's hope that it's the former.
Yeah. If you said to the people not in Washington, give me a word or two that describes Washington, what do you think people would tell you? Let's just go down. Let's start at the end. Charlie, we'll start with you. If you said to people you live with and talk to in Milwaukee, give me a word or two that describes Washington, what would they say to you?
Probably not a word I could use in this forum, but it would end with up. I would say dysfunctional, toxic.
Reihan, what would you? Now you live in Washington, but
I did for many years.
do you not live in Washington now?
I don't. I live in Brooklyn, New York.
I'm not sure that's really out in America in this way, but if you were talking to people in Brooklyn about this, what would you say?
Your point is well taken, although I will say that, and forgive me for this, but I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in the outer boroughs, and actually there are a lot of folks who live in these places, but who live in these kind of cosmopolitan places that attract all sorts of skilled migrants, and a lot of folks who wind up feeling pretty left behind. So some of these issues that we talk about in the heartland actually do feel pretty darn salient, and I think that actually this congressional race in Queens and the Bronx is a good illustration of that. But of course, the word is rancorous. I think that's the word that certainly comes to mind.
How about in the Mississippi Delta? What would people say to you, Tim?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. A lot of words have come up. Disrespectful. A lot of people question the remaining humanity that we have in our nation, and just the overall consciousness of what we're doing to each other. So there's this spirit of perseverance on the one hand, there's also a spirit of hopelessness that maybe this never changed.
But discouraging in a fundamental way.
Very discouraging.
Yeah. Jim, what about you?
So I'm going to say there's one way in which I have a similar, well, the words I would apply are words you could also read from the 1880s, 1890s, sort of Versailles-like, dysfunctional, privileged, insulated, et cetera, et cetera. A point I've been thinking about in comments we've all made is there are split consciousnesses that Americans have. Each of us is, I think, from a, so Reihan, you're not from a small town, but you're from sort of small town consciousness, where you grew up. The rest of us all grew up in small towns. I think even those living in New York, DC, Chicago, there is also this awareness of the other part of the American identity that we bring into it too. So I think that DC is seen as one of it's not, the other side would be probably the early 1960s when John Kennedy made it seem a place of glamour and ask not what your country can do for you.
And where to get things done.
Yes. And
you wanted to do big things, Washington would be where you went. I don't think that's the case anymore.
This concept of split consciousness, I think, is really important. And it explains, I think it's part of the complexity that it's also where thought leadership and political leadership and modeling is so important, that if you have leaders who appeal to the better angels of our nature, Americans can go in a very, very different direction. There may be attitudes, prejudices, angers, frustrations, all of those things that can be sublimated. It can be kind of the recessive gene if, in fact, we have a sense of shared national purpose, civic identity. On the other hand, if the top-down message is one, no, get in touch with that bitterness, express your anger. We cannot afford civility. Your neighbor is not your neighbor. He's invading and infesting your community. That has an effect as well. So the same people, it's not like one group of people is going in one direction or the other. It's like, which direction do we go in? And one of the things about America, which I think we are a fundamentally decent country, and I am concerned, will the decency change our politics, or will our politics trickle down and change this culture? That in fact we accept things that we would not accept before. We begin talking to one another in a way that we would not talk to one another before. And that I think is the big test that we're going to experience over the next decade.
And I'll be happy saying nothing else if I can say one thing in response to what Charles. And so I agree entirely with you that people have civilizations have their mixtures of good and bad, individuals do, and that these steering currents within a family, within a corporation, within a country make a big difference. Here is what I hope will happen, talking about the tension you were mentioning between this really poisonous national politics and what I'm saying is this still healthy and somewhat idealistic view at the local level. I hope there's going to be somebody we're not aware of right now who will emerge 2 years from now, 6 years from now, from whatever, whose voice, whose story, whose example, whose achievements in his or her own neighborhood or community will allow people to say, yes, we're better than this. Yes, this is the kind of example we want. That's happened in our history. It happened with Jimmy Carter, for whom I worked, 3 years before he became president. Nobody gave him a chance. There'll be somebody who might have a better achievement in office than Carter ended up doing. But I think the way this tension might be resolved is somebody, one of your friends, you, one of your contemporaries, somebody.
A lot of pressure.
Yeah, no pressure, Tim. But somebody whose story is like yours, or in Nebraska, or in Kentucky, or in Idaho, says, look, we can be better than this, and let's do it together.
And I think we're already doing that. And I think it hasn't bubbled up to kind of the national media and into DC yet. And that work is happening. And we're becoming bridge builders and standing in the gap for change and making sure that we are breaking down barriers and talking to each other and talking to our neighbors, particularly in small rural communities. And I talked about this yesterday, we necessarily can't afford to have a ongoing tension with someone in our community because we can leave a meeting and see them at the grocery store. Right. And we have to kind of face that. And so how do we deal with those challenges is by talking to each other, but also coming from a place of trying to understand, not necessarily putting our preconceived notions onto someone, but really trying to come from a place of understanding their perspective and also knowing that we necessarily won't agree on everything, and that's okay.
We're going to go to questions in just a minute, so if you want to be thinking about your incredibly smart questions, you'll have an opportunity to ask them in just a moment. But I want to talk about one last thing before we do that, and that is the role of the news media in both creating the problem and addressing the problem. And, you know, Charlie, you mentioned how all the oxygen is sucked out of the, I think it was you who said all the oxygen's been sucked out of the room. And that's been, I think, true for a lot of news organizations. It's so transfixing what's happening in Washington that we devote more of our declining resources to that, less to other things. You see that in regional newspapers and news outlets all across the country. Is that part of the, what effect do you think that has? Do you think that has contributed to some of the problems we see the need to address?
Yes, there's no question about it. I mean, you turn on, you know, network television, you turn on the cable, you know, channels, and I participate in this. You know, it is all Trump all the time. I mean, it is, you know, it's even major stories around the country do not get covered. I still am slightly obsessed about, you know, the things that we just don't even talk about, we don't cover. Why did what happened in Puerto Rico, why was that not a bigger story? I mean, seriously. But and the flip side, you do have the decline in state coverage, local coverage of regional newspapers cannot be overstated. When you see the numbers, it is really breathtaking. The proportion of the country that is actually a news desert. So in fact,
news desert meaning they don't
news
get
desert
any
where there's
coverage.
nothing. There's no one covering any of the local issues to do all of that. So this is part of the and somehow at some point, in order to solve this, you know, how do you get back to this? I hope that James is right about, you know, somebody coming up and appealing to the coalition of the decent and saying we're better than this. I really do. But on the other hand, you know, ultimately this is going to be up to the American people. This is us. You know, no knight is going to come in and change this. If American citizens don't re-engage in their society, if they don't become more informed, more engaged, if they don't care about this, nothing will happen. Part of the problem is we also need to reinvigorate local civic activity and engagement through local civic journalism. And that's going to be a big, heavy lift because of the economics of journalism, which have just wiped out, you know, what used to be an infrastructure.
Tim, let me just ask you, are there news organizations that cover what you do?
So we have a publication in Mississippi Today, that was started about 2 years ago, and that's covering a lot of the state news, and it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and that's really giving residents such as myself another outlet to tell our stories.
Has it had an impact? Because that's was kind of modeled on the Texas Tribune model, where, you know, it's got some financing. It's not making money, right? But it's trying to cover. Does it make a difference from where you sit?
Yeah, it definitely makes a difference, and I believe the model that they're using, definitely working with local residents that are from Mississippi that have background in journalism, hiring them to tell the stories of local people. And I think also too, there are a lot of, as I said earlier, young people that are using social media as a tool to tell our stories and thinking about ways that we can get our message out there without relying on large publications, because a lot of those large publications are owned by these, you know, corporate companies that are kind of set on a set of ideas to really tell their narrative and really benefit them, and to continue to really build up this whole idea of capitalism. And I believe that part of that is trying to, for us locally, is trying to democratize that and make sure that democracy is working for everyone. And part of that is making sure that everyone has the same access to resources, whether it's telling their story, whether it's starting a business, locally, nationally. That should be our mission.
Reihan, media effect, do you think, the changes that we've seen in the news industry?
Well, I guess I have a somewhat quirky perspective on this. I believe that now, thanks to digital news publications, we have a much better sense of what people read and engage with. And that has given a lot of information to journalists, and it has shaped the trajectory of many journalists' careers. One thing we have learned is that people really have a tremendous appetite for storytelling, for compelling narratives, and compelling narratives tend to have villains, right? I have read many, many stories by very intelligent, thoughtful, serious people, and those stories do not resemble the richness, complexity, and nuance that I know that they understand is out there in these stories. And the truth is that I certainly can't blame them because there are certainly imperatives, professionally and otherwise, that shape this kind of storytelling. And there's also peer effects. Another thing that I've noticed is just this incredible preference falsification. There are many people I know, not just young people, a lot of people who spend a lot of their waking hours on social media, many people in journalism. And what happens there is that you see what people with a lot of cultural capital, you see what people with a lot of social prestige think about a given issue. And so you can very quickly converge on what they think about an issue. You can very quickly form cascades of opinion and how opinions shift and change. But then actually when you talk about people, when you disembed them from that context, when you take them outside of it, when you talk to them one-on-one, you'll oftentimes get a really, really different perspective on a lot of these issues. So to this discussion we've been having about the nationalization of politics and what have you, I do wonder, and this is to reinforce Jim's point on a certain level, how much of this is actually preference falsification, how much of this is actually this kind of artificial sense that there's much more consensus than actually appears to be the case, that to some degree people are reacting with a fear of being shunned or what have you. And that's why people very carefully edit the opinions, the arguments they're willing to deploy in public versus the ones that they're willing to entertain in private. I can't tell you. There was a poll recently which came out which found that something like 92% of Republicans believe that journalists deliberately tell false, misleading stories. And of course, journalists of my acquaintance reacted very angrily, almost violently, saying, I mean, this tells you everything you need to know about Republicans. But I've got to say, I've worked, as Susan mentioned earlier, I've worked at NBC, I've worked at the New York Times, was at CNN, I've been all over the map. And I will tell you that there are people, not for any malicious purpose, but who are very cognizant of what they see as their public mission to be sure that dangerous information is not misinterpreted by a public that does not necessarily understand the world as they do. Now that's a tricky thing, and of course there are lots of different people, but I think that there really is this feeling, gosh, there's certain kinds of information we need to be very thoughtful and careful about how we couch it, and that sometimes engenders distrust. There's much more to say about that, but I do think that that is part of the divide.
So I would just say that's not the goal of journalists, right? To behave that way. So let's hope we don't.
I think there are many journalists who believe that they have a civic mission, and that overrides some of what kind of people think of as kind of niceties of objectivity and what have you, and they believe that they're doing it out of passion and love of country and love of all that is decent and good. It happens to take them away from what have been classic kind of journalistic sensibilities, but I can't say that these are bad people.
I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm saying that's not my agenda.
That's not your agenda, certainly.
And it's not what I think journalism needs to do.
But I mean, here's the point. Now, for 20 years, I understand the criticism of the media. I do think that media bias is a significant issue, and I think that a lot of the criticism of media priorities and tone is justified in order to get a better media. Now, at some point, though, it ticks over into the complete delegitimization of any media, where you've gone so far as to say, with this poll result would say, that not only is this journalism, is it biased, nothing is true, it is maliciously falsified. And this is why, while I would like to be more hopeful, I actually think that all of these trends are getting worse because it is so easy now to go into all the alternative reality silos to decide what your reality is and what your reality is not. If you see a story that makes you uncomfortable, it takes less than 2 seconds for you to swipe it away. If it makes you, if you're looking for information that reaffirms, that confirms your bias, it takes you about 2 seconds to be able to find it. And so as we become more polarized, more tribalized, I think that's going to intensify. And what's going on right now, this is not just an attack on liberal media or conservative media. This is really an attack on our critical sensibilities. This whole attack that we're getting is not. No, I think it was. I think it's Garry Kasparov, the former world chess champion, who said, the point of lying and propaganda is not to convince you that one thing is true, one thing is false. It's to make you doubt your ability to determine what, in fact, is true. It is an attack on your whole sense so that people go, I don't know who to believe anymore. I don't know what's true or not. And that is fundamentally dangerous for democracy.
I'll just say that I think the siege mentality that a lot of journalists have is actually pretty dangerous too, and I would argue has contributed to a lot of the distrust. But
so
I don't belabor it.
So we want to give you a chance to ask some questions. We'd ask you to raise your hand and then to stand up and wait for a mic to come to you. Yes, sir. The man there in the hat. And so if you could stand up and they're going to bring a mic to you. And we'd ask you obviously to ask a question, not give a speech. Thanks very much.
Thank you. My name's Andrew from Boise, Idaho. My question stems from Jim's discussion of someone new with an inspiring story, and it's specifically for Tim, but everyone else as well. Do you think individuals who are motivated to achieve positive social change would even consider getting involved in national politics, or would they potentially accurately see this as an inefficient way to achieve the change they want to see when compared with nonprofit or private sector work? Will this impair Washington's relevance in the future? In short, will there be a brain drain?
That's such a great question. Thank you. Tim?
So some of my colleagues are exploring going into politics. I don't necessarily see myself as a politician, but I think part of it is how do we have systematic change and thinking about all the creative ways that we can make that happen. I do encourage my colleagues that are interested in politics and support them. And so there's a whole kind of young generation of folks, particularly in the South, that are coming together thinking about how do we support candidates that are really thinking progressively, thinking about how do we have inclusive policies. And I think that's also a part of how do we get to this kind of idea of really making sure that our nation is really thinking about humanity and doing what's right and not necessarily thinking about one particular population of our community or our nation. So yes, I think it takes a kind of a both and approach. And so I kind of rather be on the nonprofit, boots on the ground, supporting folks that want to explore politics.
Jim, go ahead.
A brief follow-up to that. I agree very much with Tim on the both and. It's a big, complicated country. People have a lot of different motives. And so I think for each person, trying to figure out what is the most satisfying way to be engaged makes sense. I'll also say for anybody who's even tempted to think of going into politics, I always encourage them to try. It's a really, really difficult way to make your way ahead. And so there's a bias against people doing it. So I think it's good if people are on the fence, if they give it a try. There have been times in our history where there have been unusual surges of people deciding they wanted to make that engagement. During Teddy Roosevelt's time, the turn of the previous century, they thought politics was so rotten that it was important for more people to get involved. After World War II, the wave of young veterans who came back, including people as diverse as John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And now I think you're seeing in this year's election a huge new expansion of people, women, veterans, old, young, who are saying they want to take this step. So I think that's all to the good.
The flood of women candidates this year has been quite extraordinary. And the willingness of voters to choose women candidates in primaries has really been remarkable. Yes, ma'am. Right there. Yes. Would you stand up, please? And there's the mic.
Hi. Someone mentioned, I don't remember which of you, the word fiscal capacity. Mm-hmm. So this is about Washington.
That was Reihan.
Right. This is about Washington and is it relevant? So I think about what I heard yesterday. What I heard yesterday was, first of all, a Supreme Court set of Supreme Court decisions and the fact that that Supreme Court makeup is going to be with us for a couple of decades at least. Okay, so this is a very important. Washington is relevant. Yep. And if you think about this, this has been a long-term agenda to build that court to relook at major issues like Roe v. Wade. Okay, so basically that's where we are. Washington is relevant. But on fiscal capacity, what we heard yesterday is we have a booming economy right now. We have a share of federal revenue as a share of GDP, which is lower than it was under Ronald Reagan. We have a debt which is increasing at a much faster rate than the Trump administration said it would. So we'll add an extra $1 trillion this year. We're denuding the federal government of the money needed to support the social insurance systems that are so important to whatever's happening in a city in Kansas or in the Mississippi Delta. We are going to see a tax on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security because we cannot afford them, because we made it the case that we can't afford them. And we will probably have a recession in the next couple of years. So the ability of the state and local governments to deal with this is going to be in crisis once again. So I really think, is Washington relevant? The court and the fiscal capabilities of the federal government have to be part of the conversation.
And for anyone who doesn't know, this is Laura Tyson, who was the head economic advisor during the Clinton administration. So yeah, yes.
So you may know what you're talking about.
Yes.
It's possible. Let me give you a chance to talk about the impact that Washington may have because of what is likely to be a coming budget crisis, has on kind of the laboratory of democracy
Well, just out of
states
my
and
interest in
localities.
federalism, I will say that there are certain ways the federal tax code powerfully shapes and structures the revenue bases of state and local governments. So we've seen a change in the deductibility of state and local taxes, and that's obviously a very controversial issue, which we could discuss at length. I am sympathetic to the idea of having phased out that deduction, but what we didn't do is the second half of that, which is actually have some real fiscal equalization. Right. So I guess my belief is that it makes sense for state and local governments, because they have balanced budget requirements, to rely on more stable revenue sources. And for the federal government to rely on potentially more volatile revenue sources, because they can borrow, kind of theoretically over time. And instead, you have a number of states that are moving towards more volatile revenue bases, which I think is very dangerous. That's one issue. And then there's also another very, very big and important issue, which is, and somewhat controversial issue, granted, is basically the transparency around accounting for public employee pensions and what have you. If you're someone like me, I come from a public employee family, and these public employees are things that many people are counting on, but these are things that are really more and more concerning for the fiscal health of a lot of states around the country, including high fiscal capacity states. And there's another thing I want to say about fiscal capacity. So I referenced briefly the fact that a lot of our social programs in the United States are grant and aid programs, conditional federalism programs, in which basically the federal government says, I will match your efforts at the state level. One implication of that, however, is that my state, New York, which has very high fiscal capacity, is able to get a lot in the way of matches from the federal government, whereas a state like Mississippi does not have the fiscal wherewithal to do that. Now, there is this belief that, well, Mississippi has a terrible government, doesn't like its own people, and that may well be true. But even if you just look at the brute fact of its limited fiscal capacity, that is a huge constraint, whether you're on the left or the right, if you're working at the state level. These are, in my opinion, really big picture issues. They are hardly ever discussed in our politics. And I think that state and local governments are headed for a real reckoning sometime in the next decade. And I wish we were preparing ourselves for that a bit better.
Charlie?
Well, it's impossible to argue with your premise about Washington matters. And now, I actually spent many years as a budget geek, a conservative budget geek. I cannot tell you how many shows were devoted to Paul Ryan coming on and warning about the debt bomb, the intergenerational transfer of wealth. I cannot tell you how many events like this I went to where people had big charts showing that the #1 crisis facing America was to get its fiscal house in order. And then to sit and watch those same individuals over the last 6 months basically go, yeah, never mind. That's just, I'm in favor of tax reform. I like the idea of lower taxes. But, watching what's happened, and this is part of this tribalization of our politics, that it does not seem to have registered really with the 90% of Republican voters that are approving of all of this, that they have absolutely abandoned any pretense of fiscal conservatism. And, fiscal conservatism is not sexy. Trust me, I know that. On the other hand, these are, this is a predictable crisis. It is the most predictable financial crisis in our country's history. It is rolling on. Yes, the public employee pensions, dealing with Medicare, dealing with Social Security, dealing with the changing, nature of the population. So I have no idea going forward what the solutions are going to be when the one party that claimed to take fiscal responsibility seriously has basically said, yeah, never mind, we were fiscally conservative when there was a Democrat in the White House, but, let's just spend. I find that one of the most remarkable developments, the many remarkable developments we've seen in the last year and a half.
I'll just say that my views on fiscal policy are pretty different at the federal level than the state level. At the federal level, I imagine I disagree pretty strongly with Charlie, and I think it's actually a good and healthy thing that some Republicans disagree. But I think that at the state level, that kind of consolidation is important.
Tim, if we had a real federal budget crisis and it affected entitlement programs, it affected grant programs, the kinds of things that the federal government has done for states and local communities, how much effect would that have on your ability to do what you do?
Yeah, it would have a huge impact on that. And speaking to your point earlier around states really having limited budgets, I think then when you couple that, couple that with kind of these ideas or these tactics to impact already underserved communities with strategies such as requiring people to, take drug tests, to get, food stamps, things like this, and closing voter registration, driver license locations in our state because we're trying to save money in our budget. That's really perpetuating the problem. And so how do we think about creating new solutions? So yeah, absolutely, it would have a huge impact. And I think also too, thinking about how we can really create a budget with our state and local officials is really, really interesting. A lot of organizations, and we're working with, such as the New Economy Coalition, we're trying out a concept called participatory budgeting, where we actually go in and request a portion of that budget, whether it's state or local, to go to a particular community issue, and that's really helping us kind of democratize our local economy.
I think that's a great point, and our clock has gone down to 0, so we have to stop. I want to thank our panelists for being great, and also the audience questions were terrific. Thank you all for being here.